Alex is the Principal Secretary of the Department of Environment, Climate Change and Forest for the Government of Tamil Nadu. With a distinguished career in public administration, Dr. Senthil Kumar has previously held key positions, including Principal Secretary for Health, Family Welfare and Rural Development and Panchayati Raj. His extensive experience in various administrative roles highlights his dedication to effective governance and public service in Tamil Nadu. And as co-chair, we have Prof T. Jayaraman, who is a senior fellow at MSSR of Climate Change Program. He has been active in several areas of climate change, including climate adaptation and agriculture, climate mitigation and carbon budgets, energy and climate, and international and national climate policy. Without further ado, I would leave to the chair and co-chair to take the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to co-chair this session. We are very pleased to have as chair Mr. Dr. Senthil Kumar. I believe he is no stranger to the foundation. Many of the staff here know him very well through his various stints in different parts of the state in different capacities. So perhaps I am a person who met him just now, so it's a real pleasure to have him here. We have with us a very eminent panel of speakers. So instead of going through all the speakers, introducing them at the same time, we will go through one by one. First, I'd like to invite to speak Dr. Yuba Sokona. Dr. Yuba Sokona was the vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the 6th assessment cycle. He has been associated with the IPCC even earlier in Working Group 3 as co-chair for the 5th, lead author in the 5th assessment report. Professor Dr. Sokona is perhaps one of the leading voices on climate and climate policy from the African continent. He has served, of course, also several years with the South Center in Geneva, where he was one of the leading figures of the Global South Coalition on issues of climate, especially development and climate. This is something it is in this context that we met for the first time. So he is a very important voice, and now he is based in Bamako, Mali, working on important initiatives for related to energy and climate in Africa. Dr. Sokona. So speakers will have 10 minutes, and that so that we have time for an interactive session immediately after. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. It's a real honor, a privilege for me to have the opportunity to take part to this exceptional event. This is my first time in Chennai. I used to come to India since the early 80s with different connections with different institutions, but this is the first time in Chennai. And it's really a privilege and honor to be here, and then particularly to have the opportunity and then to take part to the conversation with friends. What he did not say, he's giving to us a lot of trouble, but in a good sense. Now, we have to address the climate resilience policy and practices, and I guess research is the basis for that, because research should inform policy and then support practices. But climate resilience development and can be understood as a holistic approach to development, and that integrate climate change, adaptation, mitigation. I will say climate action because I don't like the term adaptation and mitigation because both are related. Strategies into sustainable development practices. It aims and then to enhance capacity of communities, ecosystems, economies, and then to cope with and recover from climate-related shocks and stresses while simultaneously advancing social, economic, and environmental goals. Clearly, we have seen it, and then if you look at all the images and then all the talks indicates clearly that largely the work of Professor Swaminathan inspires critical element of climate resilient development revolving around policy and practice, and then from the perspective of equity and climate justice, directly and indirectly. But if we look at the policy, on the policy front, inclusive policy making at all levels is critical, as policies must be created with input from all the stakeholders, in particularly the marginalized community, and then to ensure that their voices are heard and their needs are addressed. This is not most of the time the cases. Even if you look at the global south and then look at some of the marginal and poor countries, their voices are not heard clearly. In doing so, equitable distribution of resources, including financial and technical support, is fundamental, as policies should prioritize resources, including financial, technical, prioritize funding and assistance to the most vulnerable communities, and then to build resilience against impact. In the context of agriculture, development and implementation of policies that promote climate resilient agriculture practices is critical. This includes supporting the cultivation of climate resilient crops varieties and adoption of sustainable farming techniques. And this also requires ensuring that older farmers have access to the latest climate smart technologies and agricultural practices. They have access also to training program, extension services, and the dissemination of research findings. Most of the time, they're completely disconnected from the research finding. Recognizing the unique challenges faced by women in agriculture and create policy that address these challenges is unavoidable if we really want to bring all those different elements together. And this includes ensuring women access to land, credit, and agricultural input. And policies should also incorporate indigenous and local knowledge systems, because most of the time we only rely on one knowledge system that is scientific and neglecting the indigenous and then the local knowledge. And hopefully in the IPCC context, and then this is prominently coming. And this helps in creating culturally relevant and effective climate adaptation strategy. If we look at the practice, on the practice consideration, and it is essential to ensure local community, in particular research, to identify and develop climate resilient agricultural practices. This approach ensures that the solutions are tailored and then to the specific needs and conditions of communities. And then we need to contextualize all kinds of solutions. Then one size fits all, this will never work. And most of the time when people look at Africa, they think that it's a small village. It's a large continent, and then some part of Africa is closer than Chennai, than if you take Addis, it's closer than Chennai than my country. And it's important that good practices require implementing programs to build capacity of local farmers, particularly women and youth, in the climate resilient farming techniques. And this includes training, workshops, and the establishment of farmer field schools. Best practices cover the promotion of community-based adaptation strategies that leverage local knowledge and resources. And this approach empowers community to develop their own solution to climate challenges. It is fundamental to encourage practice that enhance soil health, conserve water, and promote biodiversity. This has been largely addressed eloquently during the previous sessions. And techniques such as agroforestry, conservation agriculture, and integrated pest management are vital. And there is a need to facilitate access to market for smallholder farmers, ensuring they receive fair prices to their products. And this can be achieved through a variety of mechanisms such as cooperatives, fair trade agreements, and improved market infrastructure. And important attention should be given in establishing a robust system for monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of climate adaptation practices. This helps in refining strategies and scaling up successful practices. And by looking and integrating all those different elements, and then that lead to approach, and then into the issue of equity and justice into climate policy. It is then possible and then to move forward more equitable and just climate adaptation strategy, ensuring that no one is left behind in the fight against climate. And this encompasses many considerations: disproportionate environmental vulnerability, marginalized community, geographical disparities, access to resources, land and water, financial resources. And despite more than 30 years of climate agreement, progress on equity and justice has been very limited, if it exists at all, on the climate discussion from the scientific side and then to the policy side, the implementation. Because of several interrelated factors, there is some structural inequity and power imbalance that nothing is helping to address that fundamentally. And an economic interest and lobbying. And then the complexity of the implementation, if implementation even occur, because we spend more time arguing rather than to spend more time on implementation. And the critical element is inadequate finance, lack of accountability, because the inadequate finance, there is, this is very well known, very well documented, the finding gaps, and then the promise of financial support from developed country to developing nation has fallen short, and then we have not seen yet the 100 billion per year starting from 2020. And then the access to finance is a big hurdle for many developing countries, particularly the poor countries. And then you have much more difficulties and then to have access to GCF funding. And then the lack of accountability and enforcement mechanism by this voluntary commitment, that means you can take action if you wish. If you don't wish, you will not take any action. And this is really a critical question, particularly for those who are suffering from the impact of the climate. And monitoring and reporting, inadequate system also for monitoring and reporting on equity and justice outcome make it difficult and then to track progress and hold actors accountable. And clearly also there is a limited political will. That is clear, particularly for the big countries, the big nation. There is no political will. There are a lot of talk about climate, but addressing equity and climate justice requires strong political will and leadership. And public awareness, there is some increasing public awareness, but a lot needs to be done at that front. Now, how to move forward? Just to highlight some element. Clearly, it's important and then to strengthening international cooperation. In that context, South-South cooperation, we have to go beyond the political announcement of South-South cooperation. There is limited link between, academic researcher and from the southern countries and practitioners as well. It might be very important and to take the fishermen here in this area and then to go to have a conversation with fishermen in Senegal or in Mozambique, or to take those from the Latin America fishermen and then to bring them here. We need to really invest on South-South cooperation and then to go beyond the political announcement. That seems to be important. Enhancing climate finance, and I think that we need to spend time and then to critically look at the climate finance. And more, is those who are suffering from the climate who are paying the cost of the climate, because whether you like it or not, you have to integrate climate in your program and the project. If you are building any infrastructure, and then you have to consider climate. If you are doing anything, climate is internally integrated, and they have to pay the cost. And we need also to build capacity, but I don't like the term capacity building. I think we need to mobilize capacity. If you look at clearly at different levels, we do have a lot of capacity, existing capacity. We need first of all to mobilize those capacity and then to give to them the possibility and then to be fully responsible and to act. And it's important also at different levels enforcing the accountability, and then that seemed to me very important. And then the promising the governance, but the governance at the global level. Actually, there is a huge imbalance on governance on the climate issue. And then we need also to look at how adequately we be able to address the promotion of inclusive governance and to ensure that all the countries, all the communities has a voice. And I think that by addressing these factors, the international community can work toward a more equitable and just climate policies that leave no one behind. Those are some of the elements I just want to highlight and as a contribution to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yuba, for this inspiring intervention. And I think I speak both in my own personal capacity and on behalf of my colleagues at MSSRF that these your statements and the points that you have made are not falling on deaf ears. And I think following also Dr. Sibanda's intervention yesterday and the point that you have made on South-South cooperation, I think we need to re-examine very carefully how we could step up our engagement with colleagues and the research and similarly placed activist communities in Africa. So this is a conversation that will go forward. So next, I have great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Prof Swaminathan to speak. She is, of course, well known to us as former chairperson of the trust and a good friend, but for those who are new, we would just point out that she is an eminent economist in the areas of food security, agriculture, and rural development for more than 30 years, and has been both as an academic and as someone who intervenes as a public intellectual, has had significant impact on debates on these issues in this country. Dr. Madhura.
Thank you, Dr. Jayaraman, and a very big thank you to you, Dr. Yubo Sakwana. You have laid out the kind of, real broad framework on climate issues, which I'm very new to. So I'm going to say a little bit more about climate change in the context of agriculture in India. But before I start on that, I myself was quite surprised to learn from an article again by Jayaraman in this special tribute issue of the Review of Agrarian Studies, which I hope most of the speakers have received, that M.S. Swaminathan was the sole delegate from India at the first World Climate Conference organized in February 1979 in Geneva. And the appeal for urgent, the first appeal, as it were, appeal to nations call for scientists to heed climate change was made at this conference. Going on, and I think what I want to focus on here is the call that has been mentioned yesterday many times also, but I think for me that's very important in setting the framework, the call made after the World Conference of 1974 on food security, that, and I quote again from him, "The deadline for achieving the objective of ensuring that no child, woman, or man goes to bed hungry and that no human being's physical and mental potential is stunted by malnutrition," in 1974, they set that deadline for 1984. So it's very sad, actually, that we are, in 2024, we're still setting the agenda. We're saying 2030 or 2047. So what I want to say is, I think that whether it's, for me, whether it's climate change or any other issue, the angle through which I look at it is when and how is it related to zero hunger, zero poverty. And I think that has to be the bottom line. And if we look at, and this was also, I think, Dr. Buiba Bong, who talked about it, many people yesterday have said that this has to be the lens through which we look at whatever research we're doing. And I think that applies to, people in this room. And it can be done. China has ended poverty. And I want to also mention for some of our international colleagues here that in India, Kerala is the first state which is going to end poverty. The target is end of 2025. They have identified about 60,000 families who are still poor, and special packages are being designed for each and every, because at this level it's the family and their livelihood that you have to focus on. So it's not something that's a dream that we'll say 2047, then we'll say 2060, or we'll keep changing these goalposts. So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. Now coming to agriculture, and I think when we're talking about zero poverty and zero hunger, for us again the focus is on the rural, on those engaged in agriculture, and here agriculture means livestock, fisheries in a very broad sense. What has been happening in India? And I think this is very, very sad. We don't have much statistics on farmer incomes, but what we do have, the last data we have, official statistics, is from 2019, 18-19. Between 2012 and 2018-19, which is when we have the data, in real terms, that is after adjusting for inflation, incomes of farming households, agricultural households, there are definitional issues, we can talk about that later, increased by 18% in 7 years. But if you look at the component of income from crop production, so farmer household has to get income from remittance, non-farm jobs, many sources of income. If you look at crop incomes, it actually declined in constant prices. So this is the situation of agrarian distress in which we have to bring in now. I mean, we have to face climate change, and whether it's we call it adaptation or mitigation and adaptation, I think that's something we can talk about. And particularly since 85% of our farmers or cultivators are smallholders, what we say less than 2 hectares, so their incomes actually fell by 4%. Now, another source of official data that we have is on costs and prices. And there again, we have examined, young colleagues of mine, for the last 20 years, 2000 to 2020, costs and prices for 10 crops across 20 years, several states. And these crops include not just rice and wheat, but pulses, which we, the nutrient-rich crops, which we need to go to, oil seeds, and for almost all crops in all states, there's a state-level analysis, there's a profitability squeeze. So what does that mean? That means that costs of production have increased faster than the value of output. So on the one hand, we are monitoring the gross value of output, which is yield. It depends on yield and prices, and we've heard about minimum support prices, but that's only one part of the component. So almost all states, 10 crops that were looked at, wheat is not in that, but other maize and rice, and then it's mainly pulses and oil seeds, there is a decline in profitability. And I think this explains why our farmers are fighting for minimum support prices, because that's not the only thing that needs to be done. But in the situation today, if you can't control costs and you don't see that yield increase, then the only thing left is the price. So price support for me is only one arm of it, but it's essential right now till we work on the other arm. Now here I want to say one thing which is, I think, important, that this costs of production include, costs because of diesel prices going up, fertilizer costs going up. I don't have to talk about, Ukraine. You know all these things better than me here. But there's one component which I want to mention, particularly as I have some CG colleagues here, the costs of labor. Costs of labor are not going up. Agricultural wages in India, I speak for India, but I think it will be similar in South Asia, have been stagnant for the last decade, since about 2014-15. And in the last, I have a colleague who has done a detailed analysis, again, by operation, whether it's harvest for men, for women, by crop across states of India. And one number I remember is in the last 5 years, a woman agricultural wage worker's wage has increased by 7 rupees. I mean, what type of increase is that? That's why I'm saying that it's stagnant or increasing. And I hear about, when I talk in presentations, I hear about we are developing technologies for labor shortage. I don't see that labor shortage, at least in South Asia. I'm ignorant about Africa, so I can't speak for that. Where is this labor shortage for which we are designing? That's what the big farmers are going to say. We have a labor shortage. But I'll tell you, there is a kind of seasonal, and it's not that there's no labor shortage. Men are migrating, as we have seen, out of rural areas. And the reason they're migrating is because if they can get off-farm jobs, non-agricultural jobs, they pay higher wages. But there's a surplus of women workers in rural India today. And we are not recognizing that. And they are at very low wages. We shouldn't exploit that low wage. But if we can, so maybe they don't, as of now, I think the good term you made is about capacity. Maybe they're not used to tractor driving, but they can do it. It's not that difficult. So I think if we can train women, give them those additional skills, we have a workforce. So I think this is something I want to say, that we look at this labor shortage, and that's something that somebody who goes to the field, I don't see that in different parts of India. I think we still have a labor surplus. We have huge, big problem of unemployment, and it's particularly among women, which we are not counting. These women workers, when they don't get a job in rural areas, they don't say, I'm unemployed or I'm not seeking work. They say, I'm not working or I'm not looking for work, because they know there's no work. And I think some people, Uma Mahadevan yesterday, talking about mobility, there are other issues, safety, security, and so on. So the last point I want to make, and I'll just wrap up in a minute or two, is that we need for climate to bring in the climate variability into the picture now. So we already have low incomes. I said we have negative incomes, declining incomes in many places. Our field studies, village studies in different parts of India showing that whatever the village, rain-fed is worse than others, but irrigated, about 30% of farmers, small farmers, make losses in a given year. They're not the same people making losses every year. But if you don't have any assets, if you don't have any backstopping, that 30% loss can be quite disastrous. So we need to have a big push, I think, on yield and increasing yields in a sustainable way, increasing incomes, because as I said, income is the core for me if we're talking about poverty and zero hunger, and increasing yields. Of course, the way we are going to increase yields today, and the scientists here will know, is not going to be in the same way that it was done 50 years ago. But we cannot, what I want to say is, we cannot put the burden of mitigation on small farmers who already have low incomes. They have fluctuating and variable incomes, not just because of natural disasters, but because of price crash and market and other features also. So we can't lay all the burden on climate change either. I think that's something that happens whenever you see a fall in income, you say it's because of climate change. I think that's not correct either, because some of these problems have been there with us for many decades. But I think their severity or the way we have to address them now, the urgency with which we have to address them is going up every day. So I would say that when we talk about new and sustainable technologies, whether it's technologies that have less water or use less of certain kinds of pesticides or chemicals, let us make sure that they are technologies that can assure higher incomes to small farmers. And I think that's to me, that's very central to any climate resilience strategy. So I hope I've stuck to my time. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Madhura. I'm tempted to, there's a brief anecdote. So I was at this discussion at the ICAR in Delhi, and there were several colleagues, and we were discussing this balance between mitigation and adaptation in Indian agriculture. And so one agricultural economist colleague, I won't take names, so she said that, we should stop being embarrassed about talking about mitigation in agriculture. So I immediately responded, I'm sorry to say, saying, we can stop being embarrassed about mitigation in Indian agriculture when we can stop being embarrassed about farmers' incomes in Indian agriculture. So I think that is the way I see point. And I think if you go back to Professor M.S. Swaminathan's whole way he saw climate and his repeated engagement with the climate issue alongside sustainability and other aspects in agriculture, he was always, climate was not an end in itself. It was part of this larger set of things you had to engage with. In our IPCC, unfortunately, we seem to sideline it as so-called non-climate factors and climate factors. I think that's not quite perhaps the way to think about it. But having said that, I think we move on to our next speaker, Dr. Purnamita Dasgupta, professor at the Institute of Economic Growth. She has also worked very actively in the IPCC as an author. She has been an advisor to government and even the judiciary on very important issues dealing with natural resource management. One of our leading and most eminent environmental economists today. It's a pleasure to have her here. Dr. Poonam.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair, Co-Chair, and my esteemed colleagues and distinguished guests. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts on this as part of this panel. It's also an occasion to pay homage to Professor Swaminathan because I've always admired him as a student of economics as I grew up, because I think of him as a person who could see the connect between technology and well-being. So it's not just food security isn't just food, it's about well-being. And I think that's a very important connect. As we think of climate change today, we think of its impacts, we think of how we cope with it, we think of how we reduce it, we think of all kinds of climate action, but the ultimate focus is well-being. And that is why I was very excited when I got this invitation and Professor Jayaraman asked me to focus on equity aspects. So as I dwelt through the literature, one of the first things that struck me is I couldn't find any examples where climate action by itself achieves well-being. It's always through the route of some anthropogenic impact, some interactive sphere. How can it happen just for itself? It's because we want some sustainable development outcome, at least from the LMIC perspective, from the perspective of low and middle income countries. And I want to put that squarely on the table. We can quibble over adaptation, mitigation, and its definitions, but I think this is where equity plays a role. For most developing country contexts, low income contexts, aspirational contexts as well, where we haven't got to where we want to in terms of quality of life or well-being, no matter how we define it, through which sector or which lens. I think the connect between sustainable development and climate action comes through a focus on equity. And equity by itself today has become quite mixed up in terms of notions of justice, notions of fairness, notions of sectorally based equity. And on one hand, we have some very well recognized and persisting dimensions in which we deal with equity, whether this is in terms of gender, caste, and so on, ethnicity, and so on, and of course income. But I think what we haven't done a good job of as climate scientists is to really understand how this interplays with climate action. It's not only about impacts, and there I think science has done quite a bit, whether it be in terms of agriculture, whether it be in terms of health, whether it be in terms of learning outcomes. But what we have not perhaps dealt with so much is how climate action itself has implications for, of course, benefits and co-benefits. Otherwise, why would we undertake the action? But also in terms of costs, co-costs, and how the action itself distributes benefits and burdens across society. Now, this is something that we have not really understood very well, I feel. We usually leave it as an add-on, at least as an economist. I'm guilty that most models leave it as an add-on at the end to be taken up in some capacity. And we pick on any one dimension, maybe gender or maybe income differentiations. So as an example, if we start with mitigation, for instance, which is where most of the equity conversations have taken place at the international scale. So we have embedded the polluter pays principle into the CBDR principle, and we have thereby advanced something called distributive justice to some extent. At least we have articulated it. But there are many other notions of justice which impinge on equity. And there is a fair lot of literature out there and understanding, restorative, recognitional, and procedural justice. And when we consider those dimensions, we start seeing that fairness is a very tricky question. In mitigation, we have the carbon border adjustment mechanism being talked about now. Now, in some sense, it is advocated that this will achieve its objective of reducing emissions and serving equity in some global sense across players who engage in this in a certain way. But judging the fairness of the mechanism means far more than that. It actually means, what does it do in terms of procedural equity, recognitional equity across countries? That is something we haven't quite figured out. And I think we need to dwell on it as a developing country. Academics, researchers, and implementers probably. And this is something we really need to do. In terms of moving to adaptation, can this go off the screen, please? What I'm seeing there? It's different from my screen.
You need to close it, right?
No, you could leave it on. You can leave it on. But there's something else coming on your screen. So I would like to talk about something related to, in adaptation, giving an illustration from the context of heat and health. Now, in the context of heat and health, when we look at equity, I realize that health equity can mean very different things from equity in climate action for health. It seemed as though these were two sets of knowledge pools that had developed completely independently. And I will, yeah. I don't need it. I can just finish off. Can I just talk without it? Yeah. Okay, so heat and health. What health equity would tell us is different from what climate action on in terms of adaptation to reduce heat stress, it seems to be telling us. I won't get into details, but this is just one example. But if you look at the idea of heat stress and heat management, so what would one look at in terms of equitable outcomes? Are we looking at rural-urban? Are we looking at low-income settlements? Are we looking at cities versus non-cities? Are we looking at interactive health risks and economic risks and social risks? Are we looking at particular population groups? Children, elderly, outdoor, there's a mushrooming of literature out there. Are we looking at specific interventions at community scale? Are we looking at them at household scale? Are we looking at them from the employer's dimension? Each and every one of these has equity embedded in it. It has equity dimensions embedded in it, depending on the action that we seek to take up. Similarly, for several other sectors also, we've been doing some similar analysis, and I won't take up too much of your time, but I'm tempted to show you a couple of slides. This is work in progress. We took a step back and tried to look at how these different equity justice dimensions looked for different states in India. And so you will see that obviously these are index-based numbers. They will differ, all of us who work with numbers know that. And this is work in progress, but it's interesting. So in terms of distributional justice, we find that some of the states that actually have higher incomes do well. But if you start looking at procedural justice, if you look at recognitional justice, it's pretty interesting the way the positioning of different states changes. Now, this is just an example. I know I've overloaded it probably and not been able to explain too much to you in this short time, but what I wanted to highlight is that equity is something that can combine sustainable development and climate change, number one. Number two, I understand that there are interconnections between adaptation and mitigation, but I don't quite agree that we have reached this stage, at least in India and most LMICs, to be able to step away from the distinction between adaptation and mitigation. I think it's still very important. Funds flow, technologies flow, enabling conditions are created, governance issues are created around how you structure definitions of mitigation and adaptation and whether we are able to bring it together. And interventions get accordingly designed. I will stop there and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Purnamita, for taking this discourse on equity that was sparked off by Yuba's intervention, taking it forward, and underlining very importantly the fact that equity works at all levels. It's not simply equity between countries, it's not simply equity within countries, but even at a much smaller level, even at the level of a community, of a village, of a panchayat, there are questions of equity which are there. And for administration, this is of course of foremost concern. So thank you very much for that intervention. Our next speaker is of course Dr. Aramar Ravi. I think Dr. Aramar Ravi belongs to the new generation of institution builders of a later era. His Indian Institute for Human Settlement has become a leading institution. Its mandate from the title would seem that it is urban studies, and so it is known, but I think it covers a much wider range of activities and interests. He has been an eminent author as part of the AR6 cycle, especially in the special report on climate change and in the IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 report. So our last speaker, though not the last word perhaps, is Dr. Aramar. Please.
Thank you, Professor Jaraman. And this is my first time at MS Sarif. So I think, especially thanks for the opportunity to visit here, and at least yesterday and today has been, for me at least, a great opportunity to return to some of my roots. I spent 40 years working on rural questions, and I just works across the rural and urban issues, etc. But I think my own reflection is, building a world-class institution is difficult in India. Maintaining it is even harder. And continuing its active trajectory after the departure of the founders is almost impossible in our context. So, this is a tremendous, I would say, congratulations for you to do that. In India, everything pushes back against that. And I think, at least in my appreciation, very small window of looking at it, it comes from two things. One is, of course, visionary women leaders, which I think is very, very important, and we don't have enough of them in our critical institutions. And the second thing which has struck me, in session after session, is community-based and led processes. The science is important, the policy is also important, but the community-led processes are very, very critical. And that's from my sort of hat as a practitioner. And at least in my own experience, you cannot build resilience in the present and certainly in the future world that's emerging without community-based and led processes. It just doesn't work. Whatever you can say about the literature. And the reason, again, to share, very personal thing is, as far as climate is concerned, in the last 32 years, we made a mess of the system. I'm going to speak fairly frankly here. So since Rio, we've gone from 0.5 degrees of, elevation above pre-industrial to about 1.1 plus. So that's the classic outcome in some senses. The system is just not working. But the interesting thing is not that. The interesting thing is, in this 30 years that we've lost in some senses, we've lost an opportunity primarily to deal with emissions and essentially the fossil fuel industry in some senses. And that was a class of problem that is fundamentally shifted because the impacts have shifted. So fossil fuels are something that involve 30, 40 countries, maybe of 100 to 150 fossil fuel firms that kind of run the about 10, 12% of the world economy, and about 50 financial institutions. So it's a small number of institutions and processes that have governed this process and have pushed back against a whole range of other people for 30 years and been pretty successful in making that happen, right? The challenge, of course, is that now that we have impacts that hit us every day in the face, in every newspaper and every media outlet, let's say, the class of problem has changed. Now, inevitably, because of the scale of impacts, especially in questions of agriculture or questions that we deal with in urban contexts, it involves not hundreds of firms and institutions who could have easily done this if they really wanted to, but it involved billions of people. And that is the reason why we have to use bottom-up approaches to try and deal with this question. So I would say the class of problem has changed. So the question of resilience has sort of completely changed in its orientation. And in some senses, we have a biased set of people in the room because we come from countries in which this is the natural way of doing things and not the other way around. So that's the first thing that's there. So within the global context, because that's what the frame is of a hunger-free world, etc., effectively we're dealing with simultaneous implementation of SDG 2, of course, that's one part of it, but also 1 and 3. Fine, because if you don't do poverty, there's no chance in hell, like we just said just now, that you are actually going to do food security. It won't happen, at least in our context with billions of people involved. And if you don't do both of them together, then the question of nutrition and health is not going to happen either. And those two can't happen in some senses without doing 5, which is gender justice, and doing inequality, which is 10. I mean, there are many other things that are there. And what we've seen from COVID in some senses is, because these are all integrated systems as far as that's concerned, you get an infection in one part of the system and it runs across the whole thing. And unfortunately for us, I was involved in the negotiation of the SDGs for almost 2 years in the UN. We're going backwards, fine? And climate is going to make it much worse. And I think the only thing I would be concerned about the last 2 days' deliberations is that we're still in a world in which we're thinking about, I wouldn't say incremental solutions, but piecewise continuity with the past. And climate is going to completely shift that. It's already doing that, but we're in the middle of an exponential shift. So, I mean, if I step back, the other thing that struck me yesterday, and I'll quickly do this, was I didn't realize, I've met Dr. Swaminathan a few times. I didn't realize that, and thanks to Professor Jayaraman to clarify this in mind, that when the choice was made of going into the Green Revolution, it was done with full foresight of the unintended consequences. Fine. We knew that there were going to be issues as far as soil quality was concerned, groundwater, X and Y and Z, but we still did that tactically and made it happen. And the reason I'm laying that out is because I think we were asking a different question in the 1960s. It was, in a sense, a response, if you take the same question of, can you deal can you enable a hunger-free world with 4 billion people, and can you do this through a green revolution? That was one of the core questions, let's say. That's the response, like we heard yesterday, to a sort of neo-Malthusian question, and every generation comes back. At that time, it was Ehrlich and Ehrlich, etc. And I think, at least from the evidence that we have, as far as India is concerned and many other parts of Asia, the Green Revolution actually did that. It had significant, impacts, some of them negative, etc. And then we built on it with the White Revolution, etc. But the question that still remains is, can the marginal productivity growth that we've seen in agricultural systems and also in other natural systems, because in a landscape like ours, like Jagdish was saying yesterday, where agricultural systems cannot be sort of separated from other land-based systems that are there, can the marginal productivity growth match with the acceleration of demand, whether it's aggregate demand for food or the per capita demand? It's outside there. There's a the quote outside the room that Dr. Swaminathan led with. So I think the question, of course, is we answered that question in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, etc. And we've had a lot of other issues. The question for us today is, can that be done for a population of 8 billion? And then, given even pop division kind of projections, can it also be done for a population of 11 billion? And in our context, for 1.5 billion people. Can that be done? That's I guess the core question. And we heard the discussion yesterday about that we can do whatever it is, adequate nutrition at less than $1 per capita, etc., 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 at higher temperature elevations and this, that, the other. But I think the thing that we're not asking is, if we have to enable a malnutrition-free world, and it's not only food, it's malnutrition. It's kind of crazy at this kind of point of time, the kind of problems that we have in India. Many of the malnutrition issues are not completely related to food production. But can we have a malnutrition-free world with the current global food system that is underpinned by 3 things that are quite important? Fossil fuels, which are potentially in a phase out. Fossil water, which essentially underpins India's food security at the current point of time. And also, at least maybe not so much for India, but also certainly for parts of Africa and other parts of the world, and we know that after Ukraine, is the chokehold of agribusiness. So that's the constraint that we have at the current point of time. And obviously, there's serious supply constraints, but one of the questions that I think we should be asking, and I think Purnamita tried to sort of speak to that, is we also have to deal with demand side constraints, which are social justice, economic justice, inequality. Because if you don't address those things, they're structural factors that will not allow SDG 2, 3, and 1 to talk to each other. And finally, I would say the real question for us, and I'll come to the climate thing here, is, I mean, when we're designing for this thing, can we have a malnutrition-free world with 11 billion people in the current food system? And I guess Dr. Swaminathan's sort of hypothesis is the evergreen revolution is a solution to that, fine? And, let me break that down. So we've talked a lot about economic factors. I won't deal with that. Appropriate cultivars, healthy soils, etc. We've talked about the agrarian system and what needs to be done, many issues there. I'll just focus on the climatic factors. And there, I would say, 3 of them. The first is adequate timely precipitation and soil moisture. The second one is appropriate temperature during the growing season. The third is stable and resilient ecosystems services, and whether it's pollinators or green water is important. And the fourth one, which is a backstop to everything else, is agrobiodiversity. Last year, I had the unfortunate privilege of telling the General Assembly just before the UN Water Conference that I'm part of something called the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, that we're very sure that there will be at least 500 million people who are going to be endemically food insecure over the next, by 2050 or so. And the reason for that is not only because of the system, it's fundamentally because the climate system has impacted the world water system, and we have crossed the planetary boundaries as far as water is concerned. And that is absolutely critical, and it's going to influence this country and many other countries as far as they're concerned. So just to put it very simply, current agricultural systems, including all the innovation that we've seen in the last 100 years, have evolved in a Goldilocks environment over the last 10,000 years, fine? And that Goldilocks environment is gone. I think what we don't tell you, and I'll be very frank here from the IPCC, is countries are negotiating not at 1.5. I helped write the 1.5 report, and Purnamata and I did some stuff in AR5 on this thing. They're not negotiating about 1.5. We know the difference between 1.5, 1 and 1.5 is, huge impacts. 300 million people on the food side, etc., etc. The countries are negotiating at between 2.7 and 3.2. And it's not only our countries. That's the real story that's actually happening. What does that mean? That basically means is that we are firmly in the Anthropocene. And effectively, we may not be able to go back to the Holocene. Even if we stop emissions today, this particular place, we're 11 meters above sea level. If you take surge and all the kind of stuff, this place in 100 years' time may not be a place that you can live in. So the core challenge for us is the system is trying to deal with another set of goals. So we have to obviously deal with, trying to keep things below 1.5 on the emission side. But we would be extremely stupid if we didn't actually address questions of adaptation at 2.7. And, we said this 10 years ago, that 2 degrees is also impossible as far as, agricultural systems are concerned. They're impossible as far as urban systems are concerned, because if they, at 2 degrees, basically your ecosystem services, your agricultural systems start collapsing. So your cities are going to go to hell, because cities don't produce their own food, and we know what happens in terms of prices as far as that's concerned. So if I just give you the numbers on this, we're about at $100 trillion in terms of global economic output. The global economy is growing at 2.5%, 3%, depending on what you believe of the IMF. Last year we did a piece of work looking at risk. And the global risk at the moment is about 8.8% of GDP. And of that, about 70% of it is climate related. So about, if you're growing at 2.5%, you're currently losing about 0.5% a year because of climatic risk. And that's going to grow exponentially. So if you link that to what you need to do to deal with poverty or inequality, basically we're in a very, very serious challenge. And I'll close with a couple of other things. We have focused a lot on temperature, because temperature is something that is very important to the global north. It's also important to us in Chennai. I shouldn't be saying that, because temperature is very critical and your temperatures are going to go up significantly here. The real issue for us, I would say, especially in connection with agriculture, is the question of precipitation. And it's a mixed bag in some senses. We know that this subcontinent, excepting for northwestern India and parts of Pakistan, is going to have increased precipitation. What does that mean? That basically means is you literally have to go back 1,000 years and rework your entire landscape, and we've seen that for forestry, for fisheries, etc., to be able to capture that precipitation and do something with it. The other thing that we are discovering from the science, of course, is we've been taught that much of the incremental precipitation is going to come because sea surface temperatures rise, you're going to have more rain, it's going to come from the sea, and that may be true for Chennai. But the fact is that about 50% of the precipitation that we're going to be seeing and the increase is going to come from terrestrial recycling. What that means is that comes from what's happening from evapotranspiration, from forests, from croplands, etc., which basically means we have to really pay very careful attention to our land use and land cover, because that is what we have some control of as far as that's concerned. So the good news for India is more rainfall, it will be shorter and more intense, but we have to think about it across the landscape, across biological systems. And of course, there's the endless question that I won't deal with just now, and that is what to do with cities. So I guess one way of looking at it, and you know, we have to look at it in different contexts here, is climate change is an existential crisis, fine? But it's also an opportunity for us to unthink some of the core things that we've taken as given in our system. We're addicted to fossil fuels. That's given us modern societies we see today. We've now become, in India at least, addicted to fossil water. Both of them are unsustainable in the current way of doing it. If you're dealing fossil fuels, you won't be able to do fossil water. And of course, at the other end, the same thing with fossil fertilizer. And that is tied to a completely unsustainable frame of consumption. So we have to link those things together to make that happen. And in my appreciation, like I said in the beginning, the core question is really around social and economic transformation. Because if you don't start with people, all of this stuff will be driven by a whole set of institutions and processes that have very little understanding and respect for either ecosystems or human well-being. I'll stop
there. Thank you, Dr. Armar Ravi. And it's just that, you know, whenever we hear this gloomy prognostications of the future and how planetary boundaries are crossed, etc., I always take hope from Professor Swaminathan's utter delight that we beat all the predictions of the Ehrlich's population bomb. Until the end of his life, every lecture that he spoke about, this would figure in it. So I think perhaps that's the attitude we should take to fossil water, fossil fuel, recognize where it is necessary and recognize where we can get across it. Now, time for Q&A. With the organizers' permission, I'm going to take 5 minutes beyond the cutoff time. Okay. So now I would request Dr. Senthil Kumar, IAS, to conduct the Q&A, and afterwards we would also like to hear from him briefly about what is happening in Tamil Nadu, and Tamil Nadu is certainly one of the states which is currently taking climate action seriously. Please. So you can have the Q&A.
Thank you, Professor Jayaraman, and I thank all the speakers for their lucid presentation and also finishing it before time. So, as indicated by co-chair, it is open for question and answers. So I request the participants to be brief and also restricted to a single question, so that we will be able to address all the.
Thank you, sir.
Hand over mic.
Myself, Dr. Raja. Sir, it's only an additional information which I am giving to you. As we also discussed, the community involvement is necessary for the climate change. So what we are doing in the case of dairy activity, recently we started utilizing the biogas from this cow dung, and it's been done in a large scale. We are handling around the Banaskantha dairy per day. They are handling around 100 lakh liters of milk. Taking into accounts of 100 into even 5 kg, when you can that amount of gobar gas, biogas being utilized, and even a few drops can make an ocean. So we have started the activity. I request all the people kindly let us follow things. One interesting thing I want to tell you, when Dr. Swaminathan visited Delhi, he is the person who has given the suggestion for utilizing of this biogas or meat for this cow dung. And also he has given a suggestion how we can able to go, because the biogas is not a today activity. It's been done a long time before also. But he has given an excellent suggestion how we can able to do the same as that of milk. So if we are collecting materials and we entered also. So I think this is a take-home message I thought I can share with you all. So kindly take what we can able to do individually for the climate change activity.
Thank you for your
Bye,
inputs.
sir.
I request.
Yeah, thank you for excellent presentations on equity, farmers' incomes, and also I agree that it has to be bottoms up, the village level and community-led thing. But across countries, this climate justice, lot of talk. So as Dr. Sukona said, South-South cooperation is needed. But we are excusing the culprits, the North, saying that we don't, talk about the climate justice thing with things because they have done the most of the damage so far and still doing. So we just concentrate on our thing or not have a dialogue with them. That yeah.
Come back to that. We can take one more.
Yeah.
Not a question, just to add, because indeed, Dr. Madhura, you triggered me to think through this actually. So when we are talking about mitigation in the agriculture space, is still a far-fetched dream, and then we should not limit ourselves to think, just in the angle of soil and water or something, and we need to really bring in the social angle into it when we develop our mitigation strategies. When you are raising concerns on some data around labor shortage or the labor cost implications of some of these technologies and etc. If the counter logic is true and we find out that is the case where in the domain of migration the leftover mass is more vulnerable segment, let's say women, children, or people who have less access to information and other services and etc. So sometimes we need to think about the technology which we are bringing, like suppose that engages a lot overt use of mechanization and other aspect as well. Are those technologies are labor displacing, or something, it has a kind of a other implications where it is not conducive for the segments which are left over or something. So when we think about mitigation, probably we need to think that aspect as well, from the very beginning when we get into the intervention mode, not just soil or water conservation and carbon credit angle and etc., but also the social angle of those things and etc. And talking about a study in itself within the CGIAR was highlighting that mechanization may be leading to efficiency and productivity gain, but it is not necessarily empowering, and the study was inconclusive. And then those are the reality, and we need to dig deeper into this to know the different complex dimensions of it when we say that we have a comprehensive mitigation plan. So that is something.
Thank you. Third, yeah. One more question.
Thank you. Dr. Sokona, you mentioned that how local climate adaptation strategies need to build on local knowledge. And if you could give some examples of that, but local knowledge also involves knowledge imparted by religious and spiritual traditions of the locality. So far in the discussion, we are talking about climate science, but the dialogue with climate spirituality via local religious and spiritual traditions need to be cultivated. The second related query is that this South-South dialogue also requires a dialogue of epistemologies. Without the critique of dominant epistemology, the Eurocentric epistemology, just South-South dialogue is not adequate. And my final quick query to Dr. Dasgupta is that in your engagement with equity, is there a flight from equality? And that equity, as it dialogues with equality, how does it interact with issues like fraternity, sisterhood, and solidarity? Thank you.
Thank you. I request Dr. Sokono to respond.
Okay, I think that we are in a complete agreement, because when I said that it has to be rooted in the, I'm not, idealize the local community. There is a limit of local knowledge and indigenous community, but there is a way out. The problem is that climate is dominated by technological approach. We think that with technology we'll solve the problems, and then we completely left out all other aspects by changing our behavior. And if you look at some of the practices at the local level, certain things you are not allowed to do, certain things you can do that preserve our environment, but we have a tendency to completely reverse that. You go to many African countries, we did not used to use plastic bags. Actually, people are eating food in plastic bags. But we do have a number of possibilities at the local level. We used to do that, coming from the environment, but we have the tendency completely to forget about them. And there is some practice, as you said, there's some cultural aspect related to that. And we have to explore all aspects of South-South cooperation. It's only the policy makers who are doing South-South cooperation. They talk about it. We as scientists, we as researchers, we are not doing anything on South-South cooperation. This is where we could, because the problem is that all of us, and this is a debate on the adaptation mitigation aspect, the agenda has been set by the North. And we are discussing the agenda that has been set by the North. The North agenda is about mitigation and adaptation. If we have to set the agenda, our agenda should be development, the well-being of the people. How you reach the well-being of the people. It doesn't matter if you have to adapt or mitigate. In certain cases, you need to adapt. You need to mitigate. In certain cases, you need to avoid emissions. And we are not at all addressing in a scientific domain, avoiding the emission. That means your future is not related to emissions. This is as important as mitigation. And then unless we set the agenda, we talk about the 2 degrees. The 2 degrees has no, it is scientifically related to the condition, the situation of Europe. Scientifically, the system is not harmed by 2 degrees. And then we jump in. They set the agenda, and then we work on the agenda, and then they add on the possibility of 1.5 degree, and Aromar indicated clearly that this is not something it's achievable in our context. And those are some of the element nuances. Unless we start working on them, we'll continue to work on the other agenda, and then they will lead us for further perspective. Sorry to be too long.
Thank you. So now I request Dr. Madhura to respond.
Actually, I have a quick question for any of the panelists. I've been thinking about this, that, now we're talking about food systems. We've gone from agriculture to food systems, and from, as Schengen was saying, from, from farm to fork. And in a way, we are bringing in the transport, processing, industrial contribution to emissions. We should be careful that we don't bring it into agriculture and then say this is the contribution of the food system and then mitigate at the level. So I'd like the experts on the climate debate to comment on this. This is a question. But I just have a quick comment on what Dr. Aroma Ravi said. Can we get malnutrition free? Yes, I think we have to now talk about cereals. Everybody is talking about cereals, nutrition security. So there is a projection, 2047, Niti Aayog has done, how much do we need pulses, how much oil seeds, how much fruit, how much vegetables. Business as usual doesn't get us there, except for rice. Business as usual, because we're exporting rice, won't get us to the requirement of India. I'm talking about we'll be 1.5 billion, so I'm not worrying about the other right now outside. But I think it's doable. And I think we have enough examples. And again, we heard, one of the reasons is that any crop you take, with a few exceptions, maybe sugarcane and potato, yields in India are 1/3 of even Vietnam, let alone Japan, China, or anywhere else. So I think that this is something that, is not something we can give up and say we can't get to malnutrition-free India.
So thank you. I think we are nearing the end of the session because we have already reached the time, and we also have to go for lunch. Before that, I'd like to briefly mention about the action being taken by Government of Tamil Nadu. So we all know the consequences of climate change. So it is for us to see whether it is in torrential rain or continuous drought, even in these parts of India or globally. So Government of Tamil Nadu has set up a climate change advisory council with participants from different experts as well as economists and other leaders in their respective field, chaired by Honorable Chief Minister. So they have been guiding the state government on various initiatives. And state government has also set up Green Tamil Nadu mission. So apart from forest areas and greening of these areas outside the forest, so that we can increase the green cover. And also similarly, there is an increased focus on wetlands with Tamil Nadu Wetland Mission. So some of the participants have indicated the positive impact of mangroves on the carbon footprint as well as greening of the entire thing. So as part of improving the Tamil Nadu has nearly 1,000 kilometer of coastline. So and we have sizable mangrove area in parts of the state. So in order to improve and strengthen using this Tamil Nadu Wetland Mission, we are taking up projects. And similarly, there is a Tamil Nadu Mission on Climate Change, which of course works with various departments. So it is in the initial stages. We are getting inputs from various experts so that and also working with various departments so that we can make forward many of or mitigate many of the impact on our communities and society and various sectors of the economy. And similarly, we also have a Tamil Nadu Coastal Restoration Mission, which is aimed at improving the livelihood of communities and also restoring coral ecosystem as well as sea grasses and other marine, rich marine biodiversity which we have in our state. And all this is possible with of course, apart from state government, we are taking inputs from community leaders and also experts, institutions like AMSSRF, and also with active participation of communities. And with all their support, and I think we will be able to mitigate and reduce the impact on the communities, especially which are vulnerable here. So I would like to thank this opportunity for inviting us here, and also as a concluding remark, if any of the speakers want to give their concluding remarks briefly, then it is welcome. Then after that, we can continue our conversation in lunch and beyond. Thank you.
So strictly 1 minute each.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to respond to that question on equity and equality. I think there are different framings of this thing. I mean, depending on the disciplinary lens we bring to bear on it, we will include equality within equity, and some disciplines will say equity and equality are different things. So I think for me, on ground, equity is in operation, in implementation, equity is bigger than equality, because equality can be defined in very many different ways. And we have seen that happen in the climate debate quite a bit. And I am a little wary of it. I have seen equality being defined, being translated into things like readiness indicators for determining fund flows. And so your equality is in terms of funding countries or communities to be able to have the capacity to prepare a proposal for funding, but then after that, equality no longer matters. So I am a little bit wary about equality. I'm probably not making a very diplomatic statement, but this is in this community, I thought I could make this statement, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong. Thank you.
I think the core thing is, as far as we're concerned in this country at least, is to go development first, or sustainable development first. Climate is both an opportunity and a risk, but if you don't go development first, we're going to be in deep trouble. And we have to make our own choices. Some of them are going to be very difficult. But with regenerative agriculture, with different ways of managing water, of different ways of actually generating energy, including decentralized processes, I think there's a very good opportunity to make this happen. But eventually, it is our institutional governance and our financial processes that are going to be the biggest constraints. And we haven't thought, and we're sometimes very captured by particular imaginations in that process.
Fully agreement.
Thank you all, and thank you to the panelists, including our chair, and thank you, audience, for being here and for being engaged with the topic. I just want to, as co-chair, and I have the mic, the last word, if you wish. Right after the Prime Minister announced that India would reach net zero in Glasgow, Parliament was absolutely exercised, and Parliament asked immediately for a pathway to net zero emissions. But then, listening to that debate, it occurred to me, has the Indian Parliament ever asked for a pathway to zero hunger? Has it asked for a pathway, a timeline, and a commitment to zero malnutrition? That's the crux of the problem before us. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Hey everyone, we've come to the end of this session. And as a token of appreciation from the organizers, we would like to present a small memento to all the speakers and co-chairs. Dr. Aroma Ravi. I think we'll break for lunch now and reconvene around 2:30. Yeah, thank you.
I came in day first tonight. I was here the whole day with my colleague Jagdish. Actually,
so you see, you might be again. Thank you.